I want to be clear about one thing before I explain what happened in that ward. I did not do anything remarkable. I did not choose to heal faster than their instruments expected. I did not resist treatment in order to make a point, and I did not refuse sedation to prove something about human willpower. I was in pain, I was tired, I was irritated about the food, and I slept when I could because sleeping was the only activity available to me that did not involve answering questions I had already answered 3 times. What happened on those scans happened because it happens, because it is what a human body does, and I had no more control over it than I have over my heartbeat or the rhythm of my breathing. The fact that it terrified them is not my achievement. It is theirs. They built the scanners. They read the numbers. The conclusion they drew from those numbers, that is what this is about. I was a Navy corpsman attached to the 14th Combat Logistics Battalion, operating out of a staging platform in the 9th Orbital Belt. We were not a combat unit by designation, but forward logistics in that corridor meant running resupply under active interdiction. And active interdiction meant that the distinction between a combat unit and a logistics unit was mostly administrative. Our co liked to say we were issued rifles for the same reason fishermen carried flares. Technically, a distress signal, but also useful if something came at you in the water. He said it every time a new batch of replacements arrived, and every time he said it the new batch laughed because they thought he was making a joke about paperwork, and the people who had been there a while looked at the deck and said nothing because they knew he was not. I had been a corpsman for 11 years at the time of the Vethoran engagement. Before the 14th, I had served with a Marine expeditionary element in 2 contested zones, one of which involved a 14-month continuous deployment cycle that my evaluations described as exceptional performance under sustained high-tempo operational conditions, and that I would have described as long and hard, and the kind of work you do not talk about at length because the people who were not there cannot quite grasp the texture of it, and the people who were there do not need to hear it again. I had treated more injuries than I could count individually, and some that I could count individually, because they had been singular enough to stay with me the way singular things do. A Marine who had taken 3 rounds to the torso and was asking me, with remarkable coherence, whether his gear would be issued to his replacement or held for him, and I had told him it would be held for him because that was what the moment required. A pilot whose aircraft had come down hard enough that the canopy had not opened correctly, and whose spine I had stabilized manually for 40 minutes waiting for proper evacuation, because the situation did not offer a better option. These are not remarkable stories in the telling. In the doing, they have a weight that does not leave you, but the weight is not about being remarkable. It is about the work. The engagement that put me in the Vethoran Medical Annex was not, by the standards of that corridor, a large one. We were running a cargo transit through what our charts listed as a cleared lane, and it was not a cleared lane. 3 Vethoran interceptors came in from the belt's shadow side. Our 2 escort ships returned fire and were disabled within the first 90 seconds. Our transport made a run for it and was struck twice before the engines cut out. The crew of 11 made it to the emergency compartments. I did not make it to an emergency compartment because I was in the cargo bay when the second strike hit. The second strike compressed the port side wall, and the port side wall compressed the cargo frame, and the cargo frame compressed the left side of my body from approximately the mid-thigh downward. It was not a clean injury. The medical terminology for what it did to my femur is a comminuted fracture. The bone does not break cleanly across. It shatters multiple fragments, no single clean line. What it felt like in the moment was a very loud sound from inside my own leg, and then a heat that was not actually heat, but that my brain decided to interpret as heat, because the alternative interpretation was more information than the brain could handle at that particular instant. I was aware enough to reach the cargo bay's emergency kit before I passed out. I applied a pressure wrap around the thigh, tight enough to manage the bleeding, and then I was on the floor, and then I was not awake anymore. I regained consciousness in a Vethoran medevac transport. My wrists were restrained at the sides of a cot, loosely, in the manner of a default protocol rather than any serious containment concern. A Vethoran medical technician, I learned later that their designation was something like second-tier recovery facilitator, which I decided to translate mentally as medic, was crouched beside the cot running a scanner device over my leg. The scanner produced a quiet tone every few seconds, something between a chime and a click, and each time it ran the cycle the medic would look at the readout screen and then look at my leg, and then look at the readout screen again, with an expression I could not interpret because I had not yet learned to read Vethoran faces. My leg did not hurt in the way I expected it to hurt. It hurt in the way a limb hurts when everything in it is damaged, and the body has rationed out its pain management resources to the point where the remaining signal is constant but reduced. A deep, wide ache rather than the sharp thing I remembered from before I lost consciousness. I had treated enough field injuries to understand what that meant. It meant the body was managing. It meant the body was doing what it does. I said, in the standard trade language that most species in that corridor used for basic communications, "What is your medical status code for captive human personnel?" The medic looked at me. It took a moment to process that I had spoken, which told me this particular medic had limited experience with human captives. Then it said the code was humanitarian hold, Category 3. Category 3 meant non-critical, stable enough for transport, full examination at primary facility. It was not an indignity and it was not a reassurance. It was a box they put me in so they knew how to file the paperwork, and that was fine. I understood paperwork. "What facility?" I said. "Vethoran Medical Annex," it said. "Ninth Belt Station." "Good," I said, because it was not far and because a station medical facility was preferable to a field unit facility in most of the ways that mattered. The medic looked at me again, and then it said, "You have a compound fracture of the mid-femur." "I know," I said. "It requires treatment." "I know," I said. "I'm a corpsman, I know what it requires." There was a pause. The scanner ran its cycle again and produced its chime. The medic looked at the readout, and then it did a thing with its secondary facial structure, a slight drawing inward that I later learned to recognize as the Vethoran equivalent of a frown, though not a concerned frown, more a noting of something frown, and then it said nothing and went back to its scanner. I slept for most of the transit. I am good at sleeping in moving vehicles and on aircraft and in medevac transports because the corpsman program trains that out of you early, the assumption that you need silence and stillness to rest. You do not. You need to close your eyes and permit it, and your body will do the rest, because the body is practical about resources. I had a compound fracture and I was going to need the rest, and so I slept. The Vethoran Medical Annex at Ninth Belt Station was a clean facility. I want to be precise about that, because the description of alien facilities in human accounts tends toward either clinical sterility or exotic strangeness, and this was neither. It was clean in the way that a well-run Navy sick bay is clean, organized, well-lit, with the specific smell of recycled air that has been pushed through filtration systems calibrated for a species that is not human, so that what it smelled like to me was nothing, or rather the absence of smell, which is its own distinct sensory experience. The walls were a pale gray-green. The lighting came from panels set into the ceiling rather than from fixtures, which meant there were no shadows in the corners, which I found I preferred. There were 12 beds in the intake ward. 3 were occupied when they brought me in. None of the occupants looked at me, which I took as a sign of either the universal medical ward instinct toward privacy or simple exhaustion, and either way I respected it. The cot they put me in was slightly shorter than ideal for my height and slightly wider than necessary, which together produced the impression of a standard template that had been adjusted for an approximate guess about human proportions. It was not uncomfortable. The pillow was firmer than I would have chosen. I filed these facts away in the manner of someone who expected to be in this room for a while and saw no particular benefit in fretting about what was not going to change. A Vethoran physician came within 20 minutes of my arrival. She introduced herself, in trade language, as Sarev Han, senior diagnostician, and she carried a scanner that was significantly more sophisticated than the one the transit medic had used, larger, with a projection arm that could extend a holographic display above the scanned target rather than just reading to a handheld screen. She had the unhurried manner of someone who was accustomed to seeing damaged things and was not alarmed by them, and she moved through the ward with the particular economy of motion that experienced medical professionals develop in spaces they know well. She scanned my leg, read the projection, and stood with the display floating above my thigh for approximately 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "The fracture involves 4 primary fragments and multiple smaller debris particles. There is associated soft tissue damage. The cortical surface is disrupted along an 11-centimeter section of the mid-diaphysis." "That matches what I felt," I said. She looked at me. Vethoran eyes are notably different from human eyes. They have a wider iris range and the coloring tends toward amber or pale gray, and when they focus on something directly, the effect is of an attention that is more total than the equivalent human gaze, less filtered. I did not find it threatening. I found it professionally assessing, which was appropriate because that was what it was. "Do you have pain?" she said. "Yes." "On a scale relevant to your species, how would you describe its severity?" "Moderate," I said. "It was more severe immediately after injury. It's manageable now." She looked at the display again. "I would like to administer a local analgesic." "What compound?" She told me the name in the Vethoran pharmaceutical designation. I did not recognize it, but I recognized the family prefix, which told me it was a nerve pathway compound rather than a systemic sedative, which was preferable. "Will it metabolize cleanly in a human system?" She paused for a moment, which I read as genuine uncertainty rather than evasion. "We have limited data on human pharmacology. Based on the molecular profile, it should. I cannot guarantee the rate of effect." "What's the dose?" She told me. "Have it," I said. "We tend to metabolize faster than most." She recorded something, made the adjustment, and administered it. Within 4 minutes, the ache had reduced to the point where it was background information rather than foreground noise. I thanked her. She looked at me again with that focused attention. "You're very calm," she said. "I'm a corpsman," I said. "Calm is most of the job." She considered that. There was something in the way she considered it that told me she was turning the statement over, looking at it from more than one angle. Then she said she was going to do a full imaging series, a comprehensive holographic bone scan, multiple passes, building a 3-dimensional record of the fracture and surrounding tissue, and that she would need me to stay still during the procedure. I told her that was not a problem. The imaging took 40 minutes. It was not uncomfortable. I lay still and watched the projection arm track up and down my leg and thought about the cargo we had been carrying, which was replacement power cells for the 9th Expeditionary Support Group, and wondered how long their current cells had left and whether the resupply had been rerouted or simply delayed. It was a useful thing to think about because it was a solvable problem, or a problem that had solution paths even if I could not access them from where I was. And solvable problems are better to occupy the mind than unsolvable ones during a medical procedure. I ran through what I remembered of the 9th's deployment schedule and cross-referenced it with what I knew of the 9th Belt Resupply Network, which was enough to suggest the cells would be redirected through the secondary transit hub at most within 48 hours, assuming our CO had flagged the loss before whatever administrative processing cycle the command structure was running at that moment. It was probably fine. The people I did not know were probably fine. This is the kind of thinking you do when you are lying in a ward in a foreign medical facility, and cannot do anything useful, and it helps, and it passes the time, and it is better than the alternative, which is to lie there and feel your leg and think about how much of the cargo ended up in the debris field. When the imaging was complete, Sarevhan reviewed the full projection for several minutes. I watched her face during this, because I had learned in my career that a physician's face during a review tells you more about what they're seeing than they will usually tell you directly. The face is not always controlled when the attention is on the data. That is when you see the actual reaction to what the data says. She was still, very still, and the frown, the noting of something frown, was present throughout, but what changed as she moved through the scan data was the quality of the stillness. At the beginning, it was the stillness of focused professional attention. By the end, it was a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes before a question you do not quite know how to form. I had seen it before, in triage situations, when the clinical picture in front of a medic did not match any of the pictures in their training, and the training is what holds the fear at bay. And so, when the picture does not match the training, the fear comes a little closer to the surface, and the face shows it before the mind has caught up. She said, "I am going to set a monitoring interval of 4 standard hours and repeat the imaging at each interval." "All right," I said. "Is there anything you need in the interim?" "Food," I said, "and something to read if you have anything in trade language." She arranged for both. The food arrived within 30 minutes. It was a dense, neutral-colored block of protein material, and a cup of something warm that tasted faintly of minerals, neither unpleasant nor exactly pleasant, simply the kind of food that has been engineered to provide adequate nutrition without the complexity of flavor, which is a reasonable engineering choice for a medical facility, and not one I was going to complain about. I ate all of it. The body was going to need the substrate, and I was not going to be particular about delivery. The reading material was a Vethorin procedural manual about orbital docking protocols. That was the only thing they had available in trade language at the time. It was written in the flat, precise prose of a technical document produced by people who believed that clarity required the elimination of everything that was not strictly information, which I respected as a philosophy even when it produced prose that had the texture of reading ingredient lists. I read the first 6 sections, found Section 7 on emergency decoupling procedures genuinely interesting in a professional way, read it twice, and then slept. I was asleep for what I later calculated to be approximately 6 hours. No one woke me. This was, I would learn, not courtesy. It was because between the first and second imaging intervals, the data coming off my leg had produced enough concern in the junior medical staff that no one had wanted to be the person to escalate it. And so they had escalated it to each other in a chain that eventually reached Sarevhan's personal terminal in her quarters, and she had come back to the ward at the 4-hour mark and run the second series herself while I slept, and then had stood with the 2 projections side by side for a long time in the dim light of the monitoring bay before she went back to her quarters and sat at her desk and did not sleep. When I woke, Sarevhan was already in the ward. She had a secondary technician with her. She introduced him as Velparath, imaging specialist, 3rd tier, and they had set up the scanner on the imaging carriage rather than handheld, which meant they were planning an extensive series rather than a spot check. I sat up carefully, tested the leg's sensation, found it acceptable, and asked for water. "Before we begin," Sarevhan said, "I have a question." "All right," I said. "Have you received any treatment for the fracture since injury? Any compound, any device, any intervention that you did not disclose?" "No," I said. "You're certain?" "I'm a corpsman. I know what I've received." She nodded. She had learned to nod during our initial conversation. I gathered she had encountered human body language in training or previous contact. The second imaging series, conducted at the 4-hour interval while you slept, shows measurable changes to the fracture morphology. I said, "What kind of changes?" "The primary fragments have shifted toward alignment. The debris particles adjacent to the cortical surface have reduced in count, which suggests resorption or displacement toward the medullary canal. The cortical bridge, the initial scaffolding of new bone material, is visible along the inferior aspect of the fracture site. I considered this. That's fast, I said. Yes, she said. That is what concerns us. She ran the third series while I was awake and sitting up, which allowed me to watch the projection myself. I had not worked extensively with bone density imaging. My specialization was soft tissue triage and systemic trauma management, but I knew what a fracture looked like, and I knew what a fracture knitting looked like. The images from my own training were in the familiar visual language of human scanning systems, with their color-graded density maps and their automated annotation overlays, and the Vethoran system used different conventions. But the underlying biology was the same biology, and the shape of healing is legible across any imaging system that has the resolution to show it. The edges moving toward each other, the scaffolding beginning, the cavity starting to close. What I was seeing fell into that category, clearly enough that even without the technical vocabulary for the Vethoran imaging system's specific data tags, I could follow the basic story the scan was telling. My femur was putting itself back together. It was doing this without a fixation device, without a bone growth compound, without any of the assisted repair protocols that any reasonably equipped field unit would have applied within the first hour of the injury. It was doing it because a human body given adequate blood flow, adequate rest, and the basic metabolic resources to run its own repair processes will do this. Not as fast as it was currently doing it necessarily. The rate on those scans was toward the high end of what a human system can produce under favorable conditions, but it will do it. The bone cells multiply. The calcium bridges form. The cortical shell eventually closes over from both edges of the break, and what was a shattered section of structural bone becomes, over weeks or months, a slightly thickened but fully functional section of structural bone. The body does not consult you about this. It simply does it because that is what the body is for. I was aware that this was not universal. I was aware that, for most species in that part of the galaxy, skeletal injury at the level I had sustained was a long-term medical intervention requiring external scaffold, chemical stimulation of osteogenic tissue, and in many cases permanent implant hardware to restore anything approaching original function. I knew this the way any military medic knows the broad physiological parameters of the species they might encounter in a transit corridor, not in clinical depth, but in the way that tells you what to watch for and what not to assume. I had not thought about it until that moment as a fact about myself. It was simply a thing humans did, the same way breathing was a thing humans did. The same way adapting metabolically to altitude was a thing humans did. The same way sleeping anywhere, on a floor, in a vehicle, in a medevac transport with restraints on your wrists and a foreign species scanner chiming beside your head, was a thing humans did. The body is full of these capabilities, and most of them you do not notice because they do not require your participation. They simply run in the background while you sleep. Is this unexpected to you? Saravhan said. Not especially, I said. We heal, that's what we do. At this rate. The rate is on the faster end, but the process is normal. She looked at the projection and then at me, without any intervention. Without any intervention, I said. There was a silence in the ward. Velparith, who had not spoken, had stopped moving. He was watching the projection with the careful attention of someone who is trying to ensure that what they are seeing is what they think they are seeing, and not an artifact of the imaging process. It was the look of a technician who does not want to be wrong about this in either direction. I'm going to want food again before the next series, I said. The body uses a lot of material for this, protein and calcium particularly, whatever your facility has in those categories. I will arrange it, Sarevhan said. She said it very precisely, as if she was being careful about the words, or as if the words themselves had become less certain than they had been a few minutes ago. They brought food. I ate it without ceremony. I did my stretching exercises, carefully, keeping weight off the leg, maintaining the circulation in the rest of the limb without loading the fracture site. Then I lay back down and slept again, because sleep is when the repair rate is highest, and because I was still tired in the specific deep way of a body that is running its repair systems at high capacity, and because the docking protocol manual had run out of interesting material, and they had not yet found me anything else. Between the third and fourth imaging series, Sarevhan called in 2 additional physicians from other sections of the station medical staff. I know this because when I woke for the 4th series, there were 4 people in the ward instead of 2, and the additional 2 were standing slightly apart from Sarevhan and Velparith in the specific posture of people who have been briefed on something and have come to verify it for themselves. The posture that means I was told this was happening, and I need to see it with my own equipment before I decide what I think about it. They introduced themselves. One was a trauma surgeon. One was a bone structure specialist. Both carried their own scanners, and both ran their own spot checks before Sarevhan ran the full 4th series. When the 4th series was complete and the projection was up, no one spoke for almost 2 full minutes. The fracture was reducing. The word reducing is imprecise. What was happening was more layered than simple reduction. The primary fragments had moved to within alignment tolerance. The cortical bridge had extended along both the inferior and superior aspects of the fracture line. New cortical bone, the harder outer shell of the femur, was visible forming at both edges of the break, the 2 surfaces building toward each other like a bridge being constructed from both banks simultaneously. The medullary canal, the hollow center of the bone, was showing early-stage reconstruction. The surrounding soft tissue was tracking with the bone repair, the inflammatory response that, in a normal human recovery, would persist for weeks, already showing the characteristic shift toward resolution rather than escalation. 18 hours after injury, with no treatment, my femur was actively healing at a rate that their instruments had not, apparently, been designed to expect. The bone structure specialist said something to Sarevhan in Vethoran that I did not catch. Sarevhan responded briefly, pointing at the projection's density indicators. The specialist said something else, and then turned to me and said in trade language, "Does this process cause you significant distress?" "The fracture was painful initially," I said. "It's manageable now. Healing bone has its own sensation, more of a sustained warmth than a sharp pain. It's not pleasant, but it's not debilitating." "You can function," the specialist said. "I'd rather not run a long march," I said, "but yes, I can function." The specialist translated this for the trauma surgeon, who had less trade language. The trauma surgeon looked at the projection and said something that I could not translate and did not need to. The register was specific enough to be legible regardless of the words. It was the register of a surgeon who has spent a career understanding what bones can and cannot do, confronting data that falls outside the parameters of that career's accumulated understanding. The register of someone who is revising, in real time, what they thought they knew. I asked for more food. They brought it quickly. I ate while they discussed things among themselves in Vethoran, and I did not interrupt because they were clearly working through something, and it was not my place to manage their process. I was a captive. My place was to eat, sleep, and heal, and I was doing all 3, and the work they were doing with the information those processes were generating was their work, not mine. What I was thinking about, while I ate, was something my first real mentor in the corpsman program had said to me during my 3rd week of training, when I had split open my knuckle on a practice dummy and been irritated at myself for the lost training time. He was a chief hospital corpsman with 22 years in, and he had looked at the knuckle and at my irritation, and he had said, "Ren, the body is not an inconvenience. The body is the most sophisticated repair system you will ever have access to. Your job is to give it what it needs and get out of its way. I had applied that for 11 years, and it had served me well. I had not, until that ward, watching 4 alien physicians stand in silence around a holographic projection of my own healing femur, fully understood that this might not be a universal observation, that what my mentor had said casually, as common sense, might have been something else entirely if you were standing outside of it, looking at the data on a screen. The 5th imaging series was run at the 16-hour mark by a team that had grown to 7 people. Sarevhan had called in additional staff, and they had brought additional equipment, a second scanner carriage, a wall-mounted display unit that could hold multiple projection frames side by side for comparison, and the wall beside my bed now held 5 scan frames in a row. The original, the 4-hour, the 8-hour, the 12-hour, and now the 16-hour, all at the same scale, all oriented the same way, the fracture site at the center of each frame. I sat up and looked at them. The progression was clear. You did not need to be a physician to read it. From left to right across those 5 frames, the fracture was disappearing. Not fully. At 16 hours we were not at full structural restoration, not by a significant margin. But the gap that in the first frame had been a clear disruption of the bone's surface, a jagged line with visible fragments scattered around it, was in the 5th frame a narrow and partially bridged seam with fragments either resorbed or integrated, and the cortical shell showing continuous solid formation along most of the break's length. The medullary canal was 80% reconstructed. The surrounding tissue was in full resolution phase. By any clinical standard I had been trained to apply, the structural integrity of the bone was already approaching functional. I had not been walking on it and would not walk on it yet. The new bone needed further mineralization before it could bear full axial load, and I knew enough not to push that timeline, not because I was afraid of the pain, but because green bone under load before adequate mineralization develops microfracture patterns that create problems later, and there was no reason to create problems later when patience was available. But the scan said what it said. Sarevhan pointed at the progression of frames and said to me, "What is the expected full restoration timeline for this injury without intervention in your species?" "For a fracture at this severity," I said, 8 to 12 weeks for a return to full function, faster for younger individuals, slower for older. Diet and activity level are factors." 8 to 12 weeks, she repeated. "That's the normal range. Some people run faster, some slower. And the timeline we are currently observing, this rate of early-stage reconstruction, this is within that normal range." "The early rate is toward the high end," I said, "but within the range, yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the frames. Then she said, "We would not anticipate this rate of autonomous reconstruction in Vethoran skeletal tissue at equivalent injury severity. Without chemical stimulation and external scaffold, the expected outcome for a mid-femoral comminuted fracture in our species is long-term structural compromise. In many cases, permanent." I looked at the 5 frames on the wall. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Not as a clinical observation and not as a point scored. I meant it the way you mean it when you learn that something you can do easily is, for someone else, a genuine hardship. That particular kind of quiet that comes from understanding an asymmetry you had not previously considered. She looked at me for a moment after I said it, with the focused amber attention that I had by now begun to be able to read in a basic way. And what it read as, in that moment, was not what I had expected. It was not gratitude for the sympathy, and it was not dismissal, and it was not the professional neutrality of a physician who has learned to accept the parameters of their own species' limitations without dwelling on them. It was something more like recalibration, the look of someone who has just added a piece of information to a set of information and found that the set now tells a different story than it had before. "You mentioned diet as a factor," she said. Yes. What specifically does the process require? I told her, protein synthesis, calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D metabolism. The body running its inflammatory resolution sequence needs substrate, it needs raw materials, and if you feed it those materials consistently during the active healing phase, the rate stays high and the quality of the new bone is better. The body is good at this. It is very, very good at this. You just have to give it what it needs. She listened carefully and made notes. The notes were on a physical recording device rather than a terminal, which I had not seen in the station before and took to mean she was keeping this off the standard system records for the moment, which I understood. You do not necessarily want 7 preliminary scan records and a dietary consultation entered into a shared record system before you know what they mean, before you have had time to look at the data yourself and form a coherent account of it, before you know whether what you are seeing is a real phenomenon or a measurement artifact or something in between, and before you have considered what the implications are if it is real. I understood the instinct. I had had it myself in triage when something in front of me did not match the expected clinical picture. You want to be sure before you put it in writing. You want to look at it again from another angle. You want a colleague to tell you that yes, they see it too. I have one more question, she said, and I ask it as a medical professional, not as anything else. All right, I said. When you entered the cargo bay before the strike, when you were in the area that was damaged, did you have any expectation that you might be injured? I thought about it honestly. I knew we were under interdiction. I knew the risk profile. I was there because the cargo needed to be secured before any evasion run, and securing the cargo was my section's job. You went anyway? Yes. Knowing you might be injured? Yes. She looked at the 5 frames on the wall, then she looked at me. Because you knew the body could recover. Because it needed to be done, I said. The body recovering is not really a part of the calculation. She was still. The room was still. The scanner carriage hummed its low standby tone, and somewhere in the ward behind us, one of the other patients shifted on their cot, and there was the faint sound of the air filtration system doing what it does and nothing else. Then she said, "Thank you," and turned to her colleagues, and they began to speak among themselves in Vethoran, and I lay back down and closed my eyes, because I was tired again, and because the warmth in my femur was telling me that the repair work was running hard, and the best thing I could do for it was sleep. I slept for 9 hours. When I woke, the ward had 3 people in it: a duty technician at the monitoring station, Vel Parath at the scan carriage, and Sarev Han, who was seated in a chair she had placed beside my bed. She was not looking at me. She was looking at a readout panel she held in her hands, and she had the appearance of someone who had not slept and had made peace with that. The particular quality of wakefulness that comes from continuing past the point where sleep would have been possible and finding yourself in a different state entirely, still functional but running on something other than rest. "Good morning," I said, in the trade language formality. "It is the next duty cycle," she confirmed. "I have run the 6th imaging series. Would you like to see the results?" "Yes," I said. She brought the wall display back up. A 6th frame had been added to the row. The fracture seam was almost completely closed. Not quite. There was still a faint line of differential density along the original break, the new bone slightly less mineralized than the surrounding original cortex, the density gradient that any bone scan would show for weeks or months after a healed fracture as the new material finished integrating with the old. But the structural gap was gone. The cortical shell was continuous. The medullary canal was fully reconstructed. The surrounding tissue showed an inflammatory resolution index that, in the standard human recovery sequence, would appear at week 3 or 4, not at 25 hours post-injury. 25 hours, compound comminuted femoral fracture. No treatment, no scaffolding, No pharmacological osteogenic stimulation. No external fixation. Nothing but sleep and food and the body doing what the body does. I want to be precise, Sarevhan said. What I am about to say is my clinical assessment based on the imaging record, and not a conclusion I reached quickly. All right, I said. The fracture is, by all structural indicators, functionally healed. There is residual maturation work required. The new bone will continue to mineralize and integrate with the surrounding cortex over the coming weeks, but the structural integrity is restored to a degree that, in my clinical training, would be considered a successful outcome following full intervention treatment in my own species. What you have accomplished without intervention. The body accomplished it, I said. Yes, she said, that is precisely what I mean. She set the readout panel on the bed beside me and looked at the 6 frames on the wall for a moment. There was something in her posture during those moments of looking, not defeat, nothing so emotional as defeat, but a kind of honest reckoning, the posture of someone who has spent 20 or 30 years building a professional understanding of what bodies can and cannot do, and who has just encountered a datum that does not fit inside that understanding and who is deciding, without drama, to expand the understanding rather than dispute the datum. Then she said, I am going to ask you to rest here for one more day before we discuss the broader situation with respect to your status as a captive. Not for medical reasons medically, I believe you could walk out of this ward today with adequate support. For documentation reasons, I want a complete record. That's fine, I said. The food has been adequate. I have questions about the docking protocols in Section 14 of that manual. She looked at me for a moment. Section 14, she said. Emergency decoupling under asymmetric pressure differential. It's an interesting problem. She blinked. It was a very human gesture, and I think she had picked it up in the hours she had spent watching me. I will find you something more relevant to read, she said. She did. She brought me a Vethorin field surgery reference that had a trade language appendix, and I read the appendix with professional interest because there were techniques in it that were not standard human practice, and some of them were genuinely clever. The engineering logic was clean in a way that translated across species. I made notes on a pad she had also provided. In the compact shorthand I had developed over 11 years for capturing information quickly. I ate. I did careful exercises to maintain circulation in the healing leg. I did not walk on it yet, and I was not impatient about this, because there is no virtue in impatience when the timeline is what the timeline is, and the bone would be ready when the bone was ready, and not before. On the morning of the 3rd day, 31 hours after the 6th imaging series, 56 hours after injury, Sarevhan came to my bed and said, I would like to present the full record to the station's Medical Review Council. I am requesting your presence if you are willing. You are not required to attend. I'll attend, I said. I'd like to see the room. The Medical Review Council of Vethorin 9th Belt Station convened in a chamber 3 decks above the ward. It was a formal space, tiered seating arranged in a shallow arc facing the central presentation area. A large wall display unit capable of holding a full multi-frame imaging sequence at readable scale, the kind of room that exists in every institution across every species that has developed institutions. A place for presenting conclusions to people with authority over what to do about them. Sarevhan presented the case standing at the central area, precisely in the center of the room, in the way that says, I am here, I am not hedging. What I am about to tell you is what I have found. I was seated to one side in a chair that had been adapted for human proportions with additional support cushioning, which I found unexpectedly considerate. There were 11 council members, senior physicians, administrators, the station's chief medical officer. They wore the formal attire of their roles, layered garments in the station's institutional colors, the kind of dress that signals that what is happening in this room is being recorded, and that the people wearing it understand their function in the record. Several of them had reviewed the preliminary scan data. I could see from the way they positioned themselves in their seats that they were not approaching this as an introductory briefing. They had formed initial opinions. They had looked at the numbers and they had formed opinions, and they had come to hear the complete case before they decided what the opinions should become. Serevhan presented with precision. She was not dramatic about it. She laid out the injury profile, the imaging sequence, the timeline, the metrics at each interval, the comparison to Vethorin baseline outcomes for equivalent injuries. She did not editorialize. She presented the data and the data's implications and the limits of the data, which is the correct way to present medical evidence to a review body, and she let the 6 frames on the wall do what 6 frames in sequence do, which is tell a story in the language of data, and data is its own kind of eloquence. It does not need embellishment. It needs clarity of presentation, and Serevhan provided that, and the room received it in the silence that serious people bring to serious data. When she finished, there was a silence in the room that lasted long enough to become a presence of its own. The chief medical officer, I had been introduced to him as coordinator Shenvarath, and he had the manner of someone whose job was to make decisions in rooms like this, and who had been making them long enough to know the difference between a decision that needs speed and a decision that needs thought, said. You have confirmed that no treatment was administered between injury and the first imaging series. Confirmed, Serevhan said. The subject also confirmed it directly. She is a medical professional and I assess her self-reporting as reliable. And the rate of repair is within the documented range for this species. Toward the high end but within the documented range, yes. Shenvarath looked at the 6 frames for a long moment. What is the documented high end in the literature? Serevhan said, the literature is sparse. We have limited clinical records on human skeletal repair. The existing data comes largely from pre-conflict medical exchange and from records acquired through neutral party channels. What documentation exists suggests a range, not a standard, and the range is wide. This subject's rate is at approximately the 85th percentile of the observed range. Which means, Shenvarath said, that 15% of the human population heals faster than this. That is the implication, yes. Another silence. It was a different silence from the first one. The first one had been the silence of people absorbing data. This one was the silence of people beginning to consider what the data means, which is a more active process, the kind that makes a room feel smaller. One of the council members, a physician senior, with the marking on her collar that indicated specialty in operational medicine, said, the subject attended to the cargo during an active interdiction. Yes, Serevhan said. Knowing the risk. She stated that the risk profile was known and that the task required completion. She was not calculating on the basis of recovery capacity. She stated explicitly that she was not, that the recovery capacity was not part of the calculation. The operational medicine physician looked at me for the first time since the session had begun. She looked at me with the particular attention of someone who is not evaluating me personally, but is evaluating what I represent, which is a different and more precise kind of attention. The attention that comes from professional habit and professional necessity, from spending a career thinking about bodies in conflict and what they can and cannot sustain. She said, that is not the case for every species we encounter in conflict. No, Serevhan said. It is not. Most species, the operational medicine physician said, and she was speaking to the council now, not to Serevhan, working through a line of reasoning aloud in the way that careful thinkers do when they want the room to follow the steps rather than just receive the conclusion. Factor injury risk and recovery cost into their engagement behavior. At some threshold of injury probability, which varies by species, but is present across every species for which we have data, behavior changes. Exposure is reduced, risk tolerance decreases, It is a survival calibration. It is rational. She paused. The room was very quiet. The imaging record suggests that for humans, the recovery cost of skeletal injury is sufficiently lower than our baseline assumption that the threshold at which that calibration changes behavior, may be significantly higher than we have been assuming. The room was quiet. I let it be quiet. I had learned over 11 years when to speak and when to let the silence do the work. Then I said, if I may. They looked at me. The recovery cost, I said, is one variable. The other is what a corpsman does in a cargo bay under interdiction. The two are not the same calculation. The operational medicine physician looked at me steadily. Explain, she said. The first calculation is biological. The body will heal. The body is very good at healing. The body does not choose to do this. It simply does it. And the operator knows from training and experience that the body will do it. That knowledge modifies the risk tolerance the way knowing a parachute works modifies the risk tolerance of stepping out of an aircraft, not because falling is now safe, but because falling is now survivable. And the second calculation, she said. The second calculation is the cargo, I said. The power cells for the 9th Expeditionary Support Group, whose current cells have a service margin I don't know but that my co would know, which is why he sent us on the run. If those cells are not replaced, those ships cannot operate. If those ships cannot operate, the people depending on that support cannot do their jobs. The cargo needed to be secured. I was in the cargo bay. Those two facts were the entire calculation. There was a very long silence. Shenvarath said, finally, you are saying the biological capacity and the mission imperative are two separate systems. Yes, I said. And both are running simultaneously. Yes. And neither one substantially reduces the other. I thought about it. The biology means that what another species might calculate as a permanent cost is, for us, a temporary one. That changes what we're willing to pay in the short term. But what we're willing to pay is still bounded by what needs to be done. The biology doesn't make us reckless. It makes the math different. The operational medicine physician looked at the 6 frames on the wall. She looked at them for a long time, and I could see her working through something in the careful, precise way of someone who has spent decades building a model, and who has just found that the model needs a new variable, and who is trying to understand what the model looks like with that variable added. The math, she said quietly, is different. Sarev Han presented 3 more technical sections: comparative bone density timelines across species in the treaty record, the statistical analysis of the imaging intervals, the projected full mineralization schedule. And the council worked through questions about methodology and data integrity, and the limitations of the existing human physiological literature, with the thoroughness that serious people bring to data they intend to act on. I answered the questions directed at me plainly and precisely, and did not embellish. I had been asked the same kind of questions in debrief settings and in medical review boards, and in the occasional session with command authority that wanted to understand why a field decision had been made the way it had been made. And the practice of those sessions had taught me that the most useful thing you can provide in a formal review is an accurate account delivered without decoration. Let the facts speak. If the facts are insufficient, provide more facts. If the facts are contradictory, say so. Do not manage the room's reaction to the facts. That is not your job. Your job is accuracy. When the session concluded, Shenvarath thanked Sarev Han for the presentation, and told me that my status as a Category 3 humanitarian hold would be maintained pending further review, and that I would be provided with appropriate accommodations in the interim. I thanked him and asked if the accommodations would include a more diverse food selection, specifically whether the facility had access to anything with substantially higher protein content than the standard ration block. He said he would make inquiries. He said it in the tone of a man who is going to make inquiries and also who is currently thinking about something else, and who is filing the food question in the part of his mind that handles administrative items, while the other part works on something with considerably higher priority. They walked out in small groups, talking among themselves in Vethoran, the specific tone of voices that are working through implications rather than recapping what they have heard. The conversations in those groups had the quality of the beginning of a long process rather than the end of a short one. I had heard that tone before, in different rooms and different contexts, and I knew what it meant. It meant that what had happened in that room was going to produce something, a report, an order, a revised set of assumptions, a different way of approaching a problem that had previously been approached one way for a long time. I did not know what specifically. I was not the one who would make that decision, and it was not my decision to make, but I knew the tone. The operational medicine physician was the last to leave, and at the door she stopped and looked back at the wall display where the 6 frames were still up. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, not to me exactly, more to the room, "We should have better data on this." "Probably," I said. She looked at me. "How many of your species would produce a profile like this one?" I told Serevhan. 85th percentile and higher means about 15% would be faster. Half would be within shouting distance. "Half," she said. "Give or take." She nodded once to herself rather than to me, and then she left. I walked back to the ward on my own 2 feet, which I could do because Serevhan had cleared it that morning after the final structural assessment, and because the leg worked. Not fully mineralized, not ready for sustained load-bearing, but functional. I walked at about 70% of my normal gait, with a slight compensating shift of the hip on the injured side, and I could feel the new bone registering the weight. Not pain, exactly, more the particular awareness of a structure that knows it is being used before it is quite finished being built. I knew the sensation. I had felt it before in a smaller way with rib injuries and hand injuries, and I understood what it was telling me, which was, carefully, and I listened to it. The duty technician watched me walk through the ward entrance and stop what he was doing at the monitoring station, and watch me cross to my bed and sit down without assistance and without apparent discomfort. And he did not say anything, but he kept watching for a moment after I had sat down, with an expression that I recognized. It was not fear. It was not awe. It was not the clinical shock that Serevhan had shown or the measured professional recalibration of the operational medicine physician. It was something simpler and in some ways more honest than either of those things. It was the expression of someone who has just watched a piece of data they had thought was an abstraction become concrete in front of them, and who is not sure, yet, what to do with the distance between what they had assumed and what they now know. The gap between the number on a chart and the thing that the number represents, walking across a room on its own 2 feet. I asked him for water, he brought it. Serevhan filed her full clinical report that day. I know this because she told me she was going to, and because she was the kind of physician who does what she says she is going to do, which is a quality I respect in anyone and particularly in medical professionals, whose relationship to the accuracy of their own statements has direct consequences for the people they are responsible for. The report went to the station's medical database, to the Vethoran Medical Command structure, and as I learned many months later, after my eventual repatriation through a neutral party exchange, to several other bodies whose interest was not purely medical. The kind of bodies that receive medical reports when the medical reports contain information that has implications for things that are not medicine. The report included the 6 imaging frames. It included the timeline. It included the dietary consultation notes. It included the full transcript of my statements during the council session, which I had given permission for her to use, because accuracy matters and because I had said what I had said and stood by it. I have read the report since. She wrote it with the same precision she brought to everything else. The language is clinical and exact and makes no claims she cannot support with data. The final paragraph is short. It reads in translation, "The recovery profile documented here falls within the normal range for this species. The normal range should be considered carefully. The implications for operational assessment of human engagement capacity are significant and require further study. Current models do not adequately account for the recovery economics of a species with this baseline profile. Recommend revision." Recommend revision. I was a corpsman. I had written more than my share of field reports and assessment documents and incident narratives for review boards. I knew what those two words meant at the end of a clinical document, what they meant in the administrative language of a military medical hierarchy, what they set in motion, what they required of the people who received them. They were not alarm. They were not threat. They were the precise and measured language of people who have seen something they did not expect and who are taking it seriously. The language that says, "We have been working with an incomplete picture, and we now have reason to believe the picture is larger than we thought, and the responsible thing is to acknowledge that and to begin the work of understanding what the complete picture looks like." Those two words were more consequential, probably, than anything else that happened in those 56 hours. The scans were evidence. The council session was process. The report was the thing that made it permanent and transmissible and actionable, the thing that moved the information from one place into a larger system where it could do what information does in systems. I thought about that. In the days that followed, in the accommodation they moved me to, a room rather than a ward bed, with better food as promised, and a wider selection of reading material including a Vethorin medical textbook, whose section on skeletal anatomy I found genuinely useful. And I thought about the chain of small events that had produced those two words. The cargo frame, the cargo, the pressure wrap I had applied before losing consciousness, the transit medic scanner chiming in the dark of the transport, Serevhan's expression when she reviewed the imaging for the first time, the 7 physicians standing in silence around a holographic projection, the operational medicine physician at the door looking at the frames on the wall. Recommend revision. I had not done anything remarkable. I had been injured and I had healed, and I had eaten what the body needed and slept when it needed sleep, and the body had done what the body does. What my mentor had told me it does. What I had known it did, in the way you know things that are simply true about the world you inhabit. But sitting in that room in those days after the council, reading the report, I thought about what the operational medicine physician had said. The math is different. And I thought, yes, it is. It always has been. We just never thought much about it because from where we sit it is not mathematics. From where we sit it is only the baseline. It is only what bodies do. It is only breakfast and rest and getting up and doing the job. The math is different from theirs. That is all it is. And what they do with that difference from here on is not something I can calculate. But I can tell you that when I walked out of Serevhan's ward on my own 2 feet, 56 hours after a compound femoral fracture, on no treatment, the duty technician watched me all the way to the door. And then he sat down, and he wrote something in his log, and I do not know what it was, but I know the look on his face when he wrote it. That is the part I think about when I think about Vethorin Station. Not the scans, not the council, not even the report. That look, and then the quiet scratch of a stylus on a log entry and the door closing behind me, and the sound of my own footsteps in the corridor, uneven, careful, functional, carrying me away. That is what it looked like when someone revised the math.